Hi guys, welcome to Love and Lust Audiobooks channel, updated daily with great audiobooks. So please subscribe to me if you don't want to miss it. Well, let's go to read this book, The Alpha's Orphaned Mate, Part 2, Chapter 11 to 20. Chapter 11, Runaway Estelle. I was so happy to attend the craft fair. This was going to be my chance to get to know people in the pack and for them to get to know the real me. The rumors had spread so quickly, and I really didn't blame the pack for that. If they didn't know me, how could they trust me? This was going to be the best way to fight back against the rumors I sold was spreading. After all, she wanted to be Luna, and she had already laid the groundwork for that. She had a head start, so the best option for me was getting out there and being with the people of the pack. I was a stranger. It was clear why people would choose her over me. I needed to change that. "Hello, Ma," said the woman who had invited me. She looked much calmer than the last time I'd seen her. "Oh, please call me Estelle," I said. "Estelle," she repeated. "I'm Flora. I don't think I told you that before. Thank you for coming." "I'm happy to be here," I said. "This all looks fantastic." I motioned around us at the dozens of colorful tents filling the town square. "We have a lot of talented artisans in this pack," she explained. "I need to get to my booth, but I hope that you enjoy yourself." "What do you make?" I asked her. She looked surprised by my interest. "Just quilt," she said, pointing to a booth nearby, draped with colorful blankets.
"I really enjoy sewing."
I walked over with her to get a better look. "These are beautiful," I said. "You're very talented." "Thank you," she said, with a bright smile. I couldn't help but stare at a beautiful piece with white flowers arranged in a circle on a dark blue background. "I'll come back and buy one later. I promised I'd like to see everything." "That would be lovely," she said. "I'll hold this one for you. I can tell that it's perfect for you." "Thanks," I said with a smile. This was going well. I thought to myself, I wanted to talk to Far a bit more, but another customer walked up and I didn't want to ruin a sale for her. I walked on, admiring all the wood carvings, paintings, and other crafts on display. I stopped to admire an immaculately carved wooden sparrow. "That one is my favorite as well." I was startled by the voice suddenly behind me, but I tried not to show it. "It's incredibly detailed," I said. "Is this your work?" The elderly man smiled and nodded. "I've been working on my technique for years," he said. "I'm Russ Delvine." "Estelle," I said. "It's nice to meet you." I didn't think Russ was such a common name. "You must be talking about my son over at the diner," he said. "Oh, he's a junior?" I said. "He's a kind man. You must be proud of him." He smiled happily at me and nodded. He was distracted as a customer approached him. He looked very interested in a bear carving. I slipped away and continued walking through the crowd. I was a little disappointed that I wasn't making a deeper connection with the people I was meeting. But I supposed it was a start. At least a couple of people knew that I was polite. I kept browsing the stalls, impressed at the artistic talent in Gabe's pack. I remembered some of the things Val had told me about being a Luna and realized that if I knew the strengths of the people in the pack, including their individual talents, then that could be useful in the future. If I stayed. The size of the crowd, however, was starting to make me uncomfortable as more people started to arrive at the craft fair. I realized that I was alone, even though I was surrounded by so many people. And if Isolde showed up, things could get bad fast. I tried to brush away the thought as I admired a beautiful wolf painting. It was so captivating. I suppose that being a wolf helped the artist really capture every detail of the animal. "Why are you here?" At first, I thought I had overheard someone else's conversation, so I kept looking at the painting. "I'm talking to," you said, the same female voice in a harsh tone. I turned around and was met by the cold blue eyes of a woman I hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry," I asked. Maybe she thought I was someone else. You need to leave. She spat. She wasn't eye-sold, but the biting tone might as well have come from her. No one wants you here. The Alpha doesn't want you either. He'll never leave us for you. She was shouting now, and other people started to stare. I'm not taking him anywhere, I said, but my voice was cracking a little and too quiet. If I were more confident, I would have made a firm statement. Another woman walked up. I'd seen her before, but hadn't talked with her. You heard Anna. She said, we don't want you here. The anger in her voice startled me, and I tried to back away. But I ran into another woman behind me. Watch where you're going. The third woman shouted. Oh, it's you? Why don't you go back to the humans where you belong? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing was coming out. I kept turning this way and that, trying to find a break in the crowd. Everyone was too close, and it was getting hard to breathe. More people were crowding in to get a better look at the commotion. I couldn't get away. More people started shouting. There was a push in the crowd, and Mama Ada broke through and stood in front of me. She held her hands up and tried to calm the crowd, but they ignored her. Another woman pushed her way to Ida's side and stood protectively in front of me. I couldn't see her face, just the halo of her tightly coiled dark hair. My heart was pounding in my chest as I cowered behind them, and all I wanted to do was escape. Then things got worse. Something hit me on my side, and I looked down and saw an empty glass bottle. Apparently, all it took was one object thrown, because soon the rest of the crowd started joining it. I put up my hands to protect my head. Then I sunk down to the ground as people closed in around me. I was sure I was going to die here. It was hard to breathe, and I closed my eyes, keeping my hands over my head as objects hit me from every direction. Stop, a familiar voice boomed. I thought it was Val, but I didn't stay to find out. I took the distraction as my chance and shoved my way through the back of the crowd. I just needed space to breathe. I just needed to get away. Gabe. I slammed my fist into the table, sending a crack down the center of the surface as Charles told me the news. What do you mean she's gone? Yeah, I demanded. Val stepped forward, putting himself between us. The Fairchild girls said they saw her run back toward the inn, but she wasn't there. No one on patrol saw her. We don't know where she is, Gabe. It wasn't often that I'd found myself unable to come to a decision. Confusion didn't suit me. I was too hot-blooded for it. I stared at him in disbelief. My mate was gone, attacked by my own pack and driven away. My wolf was howling with rage and grief. Get the fuck out, I said slowly. Gable and Charles took a step forward, and I hurled a chair at him. It shattered against the wall beside his head. I screamed. He backed out the door quickly. Val didn't move. I picked up another chair and hurled it at the wall, too, just for the satisfaction of damaging something. He didn't win. We'll find her, Val said. I already have people searching. She can't have gone far on her own. Find who started this damned rumor, I snarled. I was going to make someone pay for this. Footsteps in the hallway drew my attention. What's going on? It was Isolde. She cautiously entered the room, but paused when she saw the shattered wood on the floor. Val motioned for her to leave, but she didn't move. Gabe, she asked softly. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Isolde needed to learn to stay out of situations that didn't concern her. She approached me cautiously, and it took everything in me not to scream at her. I heard, she said, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what it must feel like for your mate to run off on you like that. I snapped my head toward her so hard that it hurt my neck. Shut up. Isolde, get out. She stood still and stared at me as if she weren't sure she'd heard me correctly. I took a step toward her before I could check my anger. The fear that seized her features was immediate. Good. Blah, she'd gotten too comfortable inserting herself into my business. Maybe she needed a reminder of who I was and what I was capable of. As if he'd read my thoughts, Val intervened. He gripped Isal by the arm and led her quickly from the room. She stared at me in shock as she went. The rage that flowed through me was blinding. I grabbed the leg of the table and hurled it across the room. I screamed. If I didn't, the anger would overwhelm me. I could hear Val in the hallway trying to reassure people and to keep them away. I grabbed another chair and smashed it against the ground. I had finally found my mate, but the timing was all wrong. The pack had come so far in the past few years. It was astounding that we were able to recover from the battle that killed so many. The sleepless nights were worth it to see our little village beginning to thrive. But contentment could make one sloppy, and I had been careful not to let myself get too comfortable.
Maybe I hadn't been careful enough.
I'd done a lot of things I wasn't necessarily proud of to get us to the point we were at. I continued to work tirelessly to restore our standing with the other packs. It meant that I had to remain cold, calculating. I couldn't take any chances. But everything I'd done had been for the pack so that we would never be betrayed again. How could my pack be so cruel to my mate? Did they appreciate nothing I'd done for them? I had found them a Luna. Family was the most important part of a pack, and many of ours had been torn apart by the battle. A competent Luna could do the work that I just wasn't able to do to help our families heal. She could help the mothers feel secure in the safety of their pups. She could help the pups feel safe in their home. My word only went so far when it came to those things. Why couldn't these people see the opportunity right in front of them? Our pack would have a Luna. We would be united and safe. I seethed with anger. Yes, we had been through a lot as a pack, but none of it was an excuse to disrespect, and harm my mate. Once I knew that she was safe, I would deal with everyone who had harmed her. Whoever had created this situation was just as responsible as those who had just terrified her, whined, and physically hurt her. And all of them would answer to me. Chapter 12, Soulmate, Estelle. I think that I had some kind of panic attack. Once I'd gotten free of the crowd, my rational mind had all but shut down. I ran and let my wolf guide me. By the time I started to calm down, I was hopelessly lost. I'd come to with my dress clutched in my hand and dragging in the dust. I dressed quickly and tried to make myself look somewhat presentable. I eventually found a trail which I followed to a road that led me to a town. It was a small, quiet place without much going on. The streets were so empty that at first I thought the place was abandoned. Eventually, I came across a motel and was relieved to find a small, frail-looking man with a beard sitting behind the counter. I was sweaty, and my face was splotchy from crying. I did my best to sound normal, but I could tell by the concerned look on his face that he wasn't buying it. It was obvious I had run from something. I swore he just took pity on me because he let me check in, despite not having the money on me to pay him. I had no idea what I was going to do next. I locked the door behind me and went to the bathroom to shower. The water was tepid at best, but at least I didn't feel grimy anymore. I looked in the mirror as I dressed. I was still haggard, but it was an improvement. I had a bruise on my ribs from the bottle that had hit me back at the fair. It was purpling already and covered the entire right side of my rib cage. It looked worse than it was injuries usually did against my pale skin. I still wasn't sure exactly what had happened back at the fair. One minute, I was admiring a painting, and the next, I was trapped in the middle of a violent crowd. One woman had started the yelling, but it had quickly devolved into a riot. I wasn't sure whether anyone had tried to protect me, but if they had, they'd been overpowered after a few minutes. Once Val had arrived, I knew that I had to get away. I lay on the bed in my motel room. It smelled a little musty. I doubted they got many visitors there. My legs ached from running so far, and I was glad to rest for a while. I needed to think things through. I felt bad for leaving the village. Gabe would be upset when he found out. Honestly, I had just run without thinking. At some point, I realized I was lost in the forest and resolved to keep moving forward. And I knew that wasn't what you're supposed to do when you're lost, but I couldn't risk that. Whoever had followed me out there last time wouldn't find me before help. Maybe I should have stayed at the inn where I knew it was safe. Gabe would probably be mad that I didn't lay low until he could deal with the rumor situation. I just didn't think there was any chance things would get as violent as they did. Maybe it would be better if I didn't go back. I thought to myself, this was my opportunity to go home. I figured that I probably had sometime before they found out where I was. I could ask for a ride to the airport and figure it out from there. There was no way that Gabe would follow me all the way back to Phoenix. My wolf whined at the very thought. My attitude toward Gabe had quickly taken a dramatic shift. A few days ago, I would have gladly run from him and never looked back now. The thought of never seeing his face again made my chest feel uncomfortably tight. That damn kiss had sealed my fate, hadn't it? I didn't want to leave. I couldn't stop thinking about the way it felt when Gabe touched me. It was such a brief contact, but it was burned into my mind. The feelings it evoked were so intense. I'd never had any interest in sex. My life was complicated, and the emotional connection that came with that kind of intimacy was intimidating. Besides, I'd never met anyone that I really wanted. So the way I felt when I thought about Gabe now was almost overwhelming. I didn't love him, at least I didn't think so, but I wanted him. I pictured the smug smirk on his face when he pushed me up against the wall, and I could feel my face turn red. Damn him. He'd known this was going to happen. I couldn't leave. I decided that I would spend the night here to give myself a chance to recover. It would also give Gabe a chance to deal with whatever chaos I'd left behind me. In the morning, I would head back. My wolf gave a happy little howl at my decision. I smiled a little. At least the instinctual part of me knew. I sighed and rolled onto my stomach. I wondered if I'd have trouble finding my way back, but I doubted it. If I got close enough, I was sure I'd be able to pick up Gabe's scent and follow it to him. A rapid knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. I was confused about who it might be. Maybe the owner decided to kick me out since I couldn't pay. The last person I expected to see when I opened the door was Charles. I couldn't even muster a greeting. I just stared at him. It wasn't so much that I was surprised he found me, rather. I was surprised that he was alone. "You did the right thing," he said, after a moment of silence. His tone put me on edge. My wolf growled its unease. "How so?" I asked suspiciously. "You left. You should have done it days ago, but better late than never." He shoved by me and walked into the room. I was getting really sick of people pushing past me like I was nothing but a minor inconvenience blocking their path. "I'm going to guess that Gabe doesn't know you're here," I said as I closed the door and turned to face him. "Correct," he said, "and he doesn't need to know that I found you. If you leave now, he won't catch up to you." "You want me to run from him?" I asked slowly. "I want you to stop complicating his life. The pack will never accept you." His expression was filled with hate as he looked down at me. "I've seen people look more kindly on cockroaches. He's unable to see past the maypole, or he would send you away himself." I doubted that, but I didn't argue. Just to clarify, you tracked me down to tell me to keep running. I asked. There was something weird about Charles. I didn't get the feeling he was really trying to protect Gabe. Maybe I was wrong. He'd helped raise Gabe. Maybe this was some weird parental thing that I just couldn't understand. I came to give you this. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I could tell by looking at it that it was full of cash. Go to the airport, go home. He said. I stared at the outstretched envelope, but didn't touch it. Why are you doing this exactly? My pack is all I have, he said. You're disrupting our lives. The longer you drag this out, the more Gabe will suffer. The only one who can end this charade is you. Take the money. Go home. He shook the envelope at me as if he was trying to entice a pet to play. And if I don't, I asked. An expression I couldn't read flashed across his face. There's more danger for you in that forest than you could possibly know. He said softly. This is for your protection as well. What's in the forest? I asked. Who is in the forest? He stared at me intently but didn't respond. I lowered my eyes. Maybe he was right. Problem started with the pack the day I showed up. Gabe had been angry and stressed out ever since. It seemed like the tension wasn't going to let up. I was sure that Isolde wouldn't stop trying to drive me out, which meant that incidents like the craft fair would just keep happening. If I tried to defend myself against the rumors and the insults, I'd probably just make it worse. The easiest way to make it stop was to remove myself from the situation. The fact that I didn't want to go didn't make a difference. I was sure it hurt Gabe to see his pack fighting like this, even if he wouldn't admit it. I didn't want to bring hardship into his life. I held my hand out to Charles. I didn't want to be a source of pain for Gabe. Charles put the envelope in my hand. There's enough there to get you across the country. Gabe won't follow that far. He wouldn't leave the pack to seek you out. Just don't come back to Minnesota. His tone was final. He intended for this to be the last time we spoke. What will you tell him when he can't find me? I asked. He wouldn't be honest with Gabe. That was obvious. Won't he assume that something bad happened? Gabe was convinced that my life was in danger. I couldn't imagine what he would feel if he thought that I'd been run out of the village and ended up murdered. Don't worry about that, he said. I'll find a way to make it easy on him. I nodded. I don't want to hurt him, I said softly. Of course you don't, he said. It's better for everyone this way. You don't belong in a pack. You'd miss the human world. Eventually, you belong there. Would I miss it? I couldn't say I hadn't spent enough time away to miss anything yet. That didn't mean that I wouldn't. Eventually, after a few moments of silence, I sighed goodbye. Charles. He nodded and left the room without another word. I threw myself down on the bed and buried my face in the pillow. My wolf howled her outrage. I screamed until my throat was raw. This felt wrong, but I couldn't deny that it would be easier for Gabe if I wasn't around. I punched the pillow in frustration. The moment I was sure I had made up my mind, something happened to cast everything into doubt. I wanted to stay. I wanted to leave. I couldn't decide which was the right thing to do. I closed my eyes and thought of Gabe. His blue eyes were so intense that even in my memory, they seemed to glow. I could picture his face so clearly. It was hard to believe I hadn't known him my whole life. I never thought that soulmates could be a reality. It was one of those things like love at first sight that I thought people were stupid for believing in. The pain in my chest as I thought about never seeing Gabe again told me that fated mates were viscerally real. Gabe was mine, and that still might not be enough to keep us together. I hugged the pillow to my chest and allowed myself to imagine that it was Gabe's chest I was clinging to. He'd brought me so much comfort from the moment he held me, even when he was the one I was mad at. His touch was enough to bring me peace. Could I really leave him? Chapter 13. You find a moment. Estelle. I didn't intend to fall asleep. The physical exhaustion and emotional turmoil were just too much for me. After Charles left, I cried until my eyes stung. I must have cried myself to sleep. I sat up on the cheap motel bed and stretched. My back ached and my head felt foggy. I rolled to my feet and went to the bathroom to clean myself up. I was a mess, but there wasn't much I could do about it. There were bags under my eyes, and my face was red. My hair was a disaster, and no amount of water was resolving the problem. I had to get moving. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. I needed to figure out how I could get to the airport. I left the motel room and headed for the front desk. I'd had a bizarre dream, and I couldn't quite shake it. In it, I was in wolf form running through a forest. It wasn't the forest around Gabe's village. The trees were closer together and barren of leaves. It was late autumn, and the chill in the air was bitter. I could smell distant fires. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just kept moving. As I ran, it became clear that something was following me. The sense of danger was intense, but familiar. I didn't know who it was, but I knew that it wasn't a stranger. Day turned to night in an instant, the way it sometimes does in dreams. I continued to run, but this time my path was illuminated by a ribbon of silver moonlight. I followed the trail to a river. The water numbed my paws, but I didn't slow down. I had to keep moving. There was something I had to protect, and time was running out. I woke up before I could reach the other side of the river. I tried to shake it off, but it had the oppressive, murky quality of an old memory that was stuck at the back of my mind. The old man behind the reception desk seemed surprised to see me. I smiled sheepishly at him. I'm afraid I need to get going sooner than I'd thought. I set a handful of cash on the desk in front of him. It was more than enough to cover the cost of my room for the night. Well, that was a short stay, wasn't it? He said suspiciously. Nothing wrong. I hope. A family emergency. I lied. You wouldn't happen to know how I could get to the airport, would you? There's one option, he said as he glanced at the clock on the wall. Not a moment to spare, either. There's only one bus out of town, and it leaves in 5 minutes. Just head across the street and down 3 blocks to the left. You can't miss the bus stop. Thank you so much, I said as I rushed out the door. You be careful now, he shouted after me. I followed his directions and saw the bus idling near a dilapidated gas station. I had to run, but I managed to get my arm inside just as the door started to close. Hopi, the driver, said as she pushed the handle to open the door, wasn't expecting anyone to board. Sorry about that, dear. She was a broad-faced, ruddy woman with kind eyes. I returned her smile as I stepped up the stairs. I'm sure you don't get many people out this way. I said, sure don't. She laughed. I dropped my money into the payment box and stepped behind the line. There wasn't a single person on the bus. I sat in the seat behind the driver and huffed a sigh. How close to the airport? Can you get me? I asked hopefully. Oh, it's a long ride, but I can take you right to it. You'll be sitting for a while, though. Hope you brought something to read. I shook my head. Oh, thank you. She nodded and pulled away from the sidewalk. The lumbering movements of the bus soon became a familiar motion, and I leaned into the seat and watched the small town pass me by. The inside of a city bus is a liminal space. It connects you from the place you leave to the place you end up. But it can also serve as a partition between one phase of life and another. I'd taken a city bus from the group home to my apartment. when I'd finally moved out on my own. It was cramped, loud, and smelled like piss, but that bus had been a symbol of my newfound freedom. This particular liminal space had an ominous air to it. The feeling was likely a result of my wolf's outraged howling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. I also couldn't deny that Charles was right. Gabe would be better off without me. I would be a hindrance to him in the long run. The pack had rejected me and wanted me gone. It would be better for Gabe to find someone else to become the Luna, someone who knew what the pack would need from her and already had their trust. I had never belonged anywhere. Part of me had believed that this could be where I was meant to end up. If that part of me were disappointed, well, I had no one to blame but myself. I should have known better than to get my hopes up. But that kiss and the way his skin felt against mine, it was all seared into my memory. That was worth fighting for, wasn't it? I was being a coward, running away from this because it was hard, was a cowardly thing to do. Man alive, would you look at that? The driver said in awe. What? I shook myself from my thoughts and looked around. The sun was starting to set already. How long had we been driving? I'd swear on a stack of Bibles I just saw the biggest wolf running alongside us. Her eyes were as big as saucers as she stared out the window. Where I asked, scrambling up from my seat, just out on the right, keeping even with us, like I wasn't driving 70 miles an hour. She placed her palm to her chest and took a deep breath. Thought I was about to drop it. Scared me so bad. Aren't there a lot of wolves in Minnesota? I asked cautiously. It must have been an ordinary wolf. It couldn't have been someone from the pack following me. Sure, she said, but I've never seen one that big. What a beauty, she chuckled. I'm sorry you missed it. Yeah, I said softly, me too. It couldn't be Gabe, could it? I didn't smell him, but maybe that was because of the diesel exhaust from the bus. I pressed my face close to the window and stared out at the darkening forest. The trees were zipping by too fast for me to make out anything beyond that. I held my breath, hoping to see a wolf emerge from the darkness, or maybe a flash of silver eyes. There was nothing. I watched out the window for the rest of the drive, but there was no sign of anything following us. It was just a wolf. I was getting my hopes up that Gabe would show up and make the choice for me. It wasn't fair to expect that of him. We pulled up to the airport and I waved to the driver. It was starting to rain, so I hurried inside. This was where I'd been trying to get to since that night at the hotel restaurant. Now that I was here, I wished I was anywhere else. I fidgeted the entire time I was waiting in line at the ticket counter. When I got to the front, the young man working the counter looked at me strangely. I tried to ignore the stare. Are there any flights to Phoenix tonight? I asked. He typed away at his computer for a moment, then smiled at me. You're in luck. There's one more tonight. It leaves in about 3 hours. It seemed like the universe was aligning to get me home. I wished it would send me some sign that I was making a mistake instead. Great one way, please, I said softly. No luggage. He typed away for a few more minutes and tilted his head in confusion. When I handed him cash to pay, I didn't pay any attention to it. My wolf was whining mournfully in my head. I wish I knew a way to apologize to it. I took my ticket and stepped away from the counter. A moment later, it was settled. Everything had worked out, and I was going home. Airports are strange places. They almost function as miniature cities. There are shops, restaurants, and event centers scattered around the terminals. You can get nearly anything you'd need at an airport. Charles had given me a ridiculous amount of money, and though I was loath to use it, I did need new clothes. My dress was in a terrible state after my miles-long run through the forest. Spending some time shopping offered at least a short reprieve from the circles I was running in my head. Gabe's deep blue eyes kept flashing through my mind. It made me feel like I was being watched. I managed to find a pair of sweatpants and a Minnesota sweatshirt. Once I was changed, I went in search of food. I had no appetite. Everything I considered paled in comparison to a sandwich or soup from Russ's. The smell of citrus from the smoothie bar was driving me crazy. It was agitating my wolf, who had been whining intermittently since we arrived here. Eventually, I gave up on the idea of food and went to wait by my terminal. I'd be home soon, and I could put all of this behind me. With enough time, I could convince myself that this had all been a dream. I would forget about my time in the forest. I would forget about Gabe. I was lying to myself, and I knew it. A voice crackled over the intercom and announced that my flight would begin boarding soon. I watched the people around me gather up their carry-on bags and prepare to board the plane. I didn't move. This moment was heavy. There was a finality to it that weighed heavily on my heart. If I got on that plane, I wouldn't be able to come back. I would never learn more about what I am. I would never be part of a pack. I would never see Gabe again. I watched people line up at the door and prepare to board. This was the moment that would define the rest of my life. I stood and started to walk. Chapter 14. Stay with me. Gabe. My concern with finding my mate was warring with the anger I felt for those who had driven her away. The source of the rumor was still a mystery to me, but I was able to track down the person responsible for striking her. Aiden Barlow, a 16-year-old student. Val had asked me to take it easy on the boy. His father had made no such request. When he'd opened the door and found me standing there, a look of resignation had passed over his face. "I'll get him for you," he said. I stepped into the modest house and waited. I could hear hushed voices at the end of the hallway. The boy walked out slowly with his father close behind him. He was a tall, willowy boy with sandy hair and dark eyes. He'd be a strong man in just a few years now. He looked uncomfortable in his own skin. Aiden kept his chin raised, but the fear in his eyes was clear. "You attacked my mate?" I said. "I did." He looked away toward his father, but the older man simply shook his head. "She wants you to leave the pack." "Look at me when you speak to me," I commanded. The boy lifted his eyes, but he was struggling to meet my gaze. "Did she tell you that she wanted me to leave?" "No, Alpha." "How do you know what her intentions are then?" He was young, but no longer a child. He should have understood the gravity of his actions. I could tell by the nervous movement of his hands that it was only now sinking in. He looked at me uncertainly. "Everyone is talking about it." "Who exactly told you this lie?" I demanded. When he didn't respond, I seized the front of his shirt and lifted him from his feet. My patience is thin. I warned. The boy's father kept a close eye on me, but made no move to intervene. "I heard it from the girls in my class. They said they heard about it from the barista at the coffee shop. I don't know who said it first." His words came out in a rush. I dropped him, and he landed hard on the ground. "Do you have any idea what I would do to you if you weren't a child?" I asked him calmly. He shook his head, but his eyes widened. "When I leave, ask your father what happened to the man who insulted my beta's mate 5 years ago." The way his breathing changed told me that he already knew the story. I could see his father grimace then. "Thank the moon goddess that I chose to spare you." He nodded frantically with tears gathering in his eyes. "Yes, Alpha." I left him crying on the ground. Estelle would be mad if she found out I'd hurt a child, even on her behalf. If I weren't certain of that, I wasn't sure how I would have handled the boy. Estelle was skittish. She was running because she had been attacked. I had to remind myself of these things to ease the sense of betrayal. My wolf was in a frenzy, and it only got worse the longer she was away. I made my way toward the village. I would find out the origin of this ridiculous lie, no matter how long it took. Gabe, I turned to find Val rushing toward me. He was out of breath, and Estelle was not with him. Well, I demanded. He shook his head. I don't know how she got so far. She was in town. How did she get past the patrol? I have no idea, he said. No one noticed anything. I had to admit that I was impressed with Estelle. She had slipped by our territorial patrol without raising any alarms. I'd have to deal with the lapse of our security at a later date. She was in town? Where is she now? He shook his head on a bus. Heading to the city, I tried to follow, but...
He made a helpless gesture. I nodded.
There was only so much I could expect of him. I'll go get her, I said. Val opened his mouth to protest, but I silenced him. I don't trust myself to deal with the pack right now. I admitted the rage my wolf was feeling only amplified my own. I could not sit around and wait while others searched for her any longer. Val nodded. Fine, I'll keep it under control here. I didn't waste more time talking. My wolf was nearly frantic. The drive to the city took several hours, but it passed in a blur. I caught her scent as soon as I was on the main road and followed it all the way to the airport. The feeling that gripped me when I realized where she had gone was hard to describe. I was angry, I felt betrayed and rejected, but a through line of despair linked it all. I couldn't believe that she would really leave me like this.
My mind was in disarray as I rushed into the building. I knew that if I drew too much attention, I would be detained or ejected.
I kept my face neutral and followed her scent through the concourse and toward the terminals. It was fresh. I could only hope that her plane hadn't boarded yet. I was stymied at the security checkpoint without a ticket. I couldn't go any further. Trying to remain calm was difficult. I was trying to think of the best course of action, but the tumult of emotions in my mind and my wolf's fury at being kept from my mate made it difficult to think. I was at risk of losing control of myself. Gabe. I whirled toward the soft voice. Estelle was standing a few yards away. Her clothes were different, and she had a coffee in her hand. She looked so casual, it didn't fit the urgency of the situation at all. The look on her face was one of surprise, but not shock or fear. It stalled me in my tracks. I expected her to run or to argue when I found her. I didn't expect her to look relieved. She smiled and hurried toward me. What are you doing here? That's a stupid question, I said. My wolf was howling with delight. Her scent went right to my head. She wrinkled her nose, but the smile remained right. Well, I'm glad you found me. I had no idea how to get back. I could only blink at her. I must have been hearing things. If she planned to come back, then what the hell was she doing at the airport? What are you doing here? I demanded. Well, I was gonna go home, she said. She paused and looked uncertain for a moment, as if there was more she wanted to say. Anyway, they called us for boarding, and I just couldn't do it. I realized that if I got on that plane, I could never come back. And that's not what I want. You don't want to leave? I asked. I didn't understand what had changed. No, I don't want to leave. She tilted her head and looked at me strangely. I just needed the choice to be mine. I needed to know that it's what I really wanted. I didn't understand, but that didn't matter. The relief that flooded through me was like nothing I'd ever felt. All I could do was stare at Estelle with the fear gone from her eyes. I felt like I was seeing her for the first time. She was thin, but not frail, and pale without looking sickly.
Her hair was a bright, light red that drew the eye. I found myself staring at her red Cupid's bow lip. "How did you know where I was?" she asked. "Val found you. He followed you out of town, but couldn't keep up with the bus." I explained. "Oh," she said excitedly, "so the bus driver did see a wolf following us." I nodded. I wasn't surprised that Val had shifted to follow the bus. He was the fastest wolf I'd ever known, at least twice as fast as anyone else. I owed him a proper thank you.
I'm glad he tracked me down. I was hoping that you'd be looking for me. I really didn't know how I was going to get back.
"You're not lying? You were going to return on your own?" I could only look for signs of deception as she spoke. I saw none. "You're surprised," she said. She had a satisfied look on her face. It was cute, although it did irritate me. "Shouldn't I be? You've done nothing but run from me since I found you." She had reason to be afraid. I understood that, but even in the face of logic, she stubbornly refused to obey me. "Stay, skittish girl. I feel like I should get a little bit of a pass this time," she said defiantly. "I was under attack when I ran." "Stop," I growled. "Those responsible will be punished." "No," she said firmly. "I'm a little freaked out and bruised, but that's all. It's not worth making a big deal out of." "You're hurt?" I asked. I should have been harsher with the boy. When I got back, I would. Her hand slid up my forearm and gripped my elbow lightly. I said, "I'm okay." She insisted. "You don't have to avenge my honor or whatever. It's just a bruise. I'm okay. And I want to come home with you." Heat flooded through me at her touch and her words. I stared at her, trying to discern anything deceptive in her expression. She looked amused and a little tired. I put my hand on her lower back and pulled her in for a kiss. She pushed into the contact and sighed. My wolf howled victoriously. Her cool fingers trailed up my bicep as she deepened the kiss. Her scent was intoxicating. She pulled away suddenly as if she had just realized what was happening. Her cheeks were stained red as she looked sheepishly at me. "Maybe we should hold off on the celebration until we get home," she said nervously. She glanced around us and wrapped her arms around her stomach. I couldn't help but smile at her shyness. It only made me want to kiss her again. "Let's go," I said. She nodded and put her hand in mine. I stared at her in surprise before grasping her hand gently. She laced her fingers with mine. She stayed close and held on to me as we walked to the exit. It was as though she were trying to placate me. I wouldn't complain if that was the case. Her proximity brought my wolf peace, and I was finally able to think clearly. Estelle's time with the pack had been plagued by rumors from the first day. There had to be a source of the disquiet spreading through the pack. I would find it and root it out before more damage could be done. I would not allow anyone to take my mate from me. Chapter 15. Finale. It was nearly 3 a.m. when we finally made it back to the village. I was tired, and I could tell that Gabe was too. We barely reached the cobblestone walkway before Val was running to greet us. The look of relief on his face made me feel guilty. "Thank the goddess you found her," he said excitedly. "She was on her way back, actually," Gabe said. I might have imagined it, but he sounded pleased. Val smiled at me. "That's good to hear." "You can go home, Val. Get some rest. Tell Lucky I'm sorry for keeping you out all night again." Gabe reached his hand out, and he and Val clasped arms. "She'll say the same thing. She always does," Val said with a laugh. "She gets the bed to herself when I work late." Val nodded gratefully and smiled at me. "Welcome back, Estelle." I waved as he turned and hurried toward home. "Lucky is his mate?" I asked. "You haven't met her yet, have you?" Gabe asked. I shook my head. "I hadn't met most of the pack yet. I'll make sure to introduce you." "Thanks," I said softly. I would need to meet a lot more people if I was going to stay as Gabe's mate.
It was a little overwhelming to think about. I didn't know how big the pack was exactly, but it seemed pretty sizable.
I'd like you to stay with me tonight, Gabe said.
I looked up and realized that we'd reached the inn. He was looking down at me with a carefully schooled expression.
After that kiss at the airport, I was pretty sure I knew what would happen if I went home with him.
I bit my lip and tried not to fidget. Was I ready for that? My wolf was pushing me to accept, so at least part of me was.
What the hell, why keep fighting this feeling? Gabe had said it himself when I first arrived here. I wanted him to touch me. Okay, he actually smiled. It made him look much younger. I couldn't help but smile back.
We walked on, enjoying the crisp air and the bright moonlight. It was romantic. There was no other word for it.
My heart didn't start to hammer uncertainly until we stepped inside the house. Gabe led me down the main hallway. There was a staircase I'd never noticed before, and he motioned for me to go ahead of him.
I smiled uneasily and started to climb. With each step, the anticipation increased.
I was hyper aware of Gabe as he followed behind me. I could hear his steady breathing and footstep. The sweet citrus of his scent was going to my head. I was getting incredibly nervous. We reached the top of the landing, and Gabe led me to the end of the hallway. He opened the door to a bedroom, and I could tell by the scent of cedarwood that it was his room. I stood in front of the door, unable to take a step inside. Gabe stopped beside me and looked at me curiously. "What's wrong?" "I'm not changing my mind," I said, "but I should tell you that I'm a off." I took a breath. Why was this so hard to say? I could feel my face turning red as I tried to find the word.
Gabe looked amused, I know he said.
"Yeah." I suspected, but now I know, he said with a chuckle. I was too embarrassed to be angry that he was laughing at me. My face felt hot, and I was sure it was bright red. My awkward stuttering gave me away. I joked lamely. Gabe brought his hand to my cheek and leaned down to kiss me. It was a brief contact, but it made my heart sore. "I'd like you to stay with me tonight," he said softly. "That doesn't mean you have to have sex with me." I muttered, "I just wanted you to know why I might be, why it might not live up to." God, I couldn't look him in the eye. I felt like an idiot, stammering the way I was. I yelped as Gabe suddenly lifted me from my feet. I wrapped my legs around his waist to keep myself from falling, and he held me steady with one hand on my thigh. I opened my mouth to shout at him for frightening me, but he gripped the side of my head and pulled me into a kiss. I groaned against him and wrapped my arms around his neck. It was a strange angle, but it gave me more control over the kiss. I tentatively licked at his lips, and he took it as an invitation to steal my breath away. Gabe broke the kiss and walked into the room. He kicked the door shut and carried me toward the bed. "Speak up for yourself," he rumbled against my neck before kissing my pulse point. I moaned and tangled my fingers in his hair. Every point of contact between us felt warm. It was hard to focus on his words, but I did my best. "If I'm hurting you or you're uncomfortable, tell me." "I will," I said breathlessly. We reached the foot of the bed, and he lowered me to the mattress. He stepped forward, standing between my legs. Gabe cupped my chin and looked me in the eye. I felt like I was floating. The way his touch affected me was impossible to describe. "If you want me to stop, say so," he ordered. "Gabe, I get it," I said impatiently. He growled, and I found myself lying face down on the soft mattress with Gabe pressed into my back. He kissed the back of my neck and whispered into my ear. "I don't think you do get it," he said. "I'm going to do what I want. And unless you speak up, I won't stop." "Oh," I said softly.
My entire body shivered as he slid his hand up my side, pushing my shirt up and dragging his fingers along my rib. I'd pushed myself up enough to turn onto my back. The look in his eyes filled me with desire. It was the same look he'd been giving me all along, but now I recognized it. He was looking at me like he wanted to devour me.
I pushed lightly at his chest and he immediately sat back, giving me space. I smiled uncertainly and sat up.
Quickly, so that I wouldn't lose my nerve, I pulled my sweatshirt over my head and tossed it aside. The growl that came from Gabe was so deep that I thought it was thunder for a moment. He grabbed my waist and pulled me onto his lap. He kissed my collarbone and wrapped his arms around me. I sighed and threw my head back as he kissed his way up my neck. I felt vulnerable and exposed, and it sent a thrill through me. His teeth grazed my throat, and the sound that came out of me was an embarrassingly whiny plea. He cursed and nipped at my skin, pulling another whine from me. His hands dragged down my sides before gripping my hips firmly.
"Keep making sounds like that for me," he said softly.
I groaned and wished that I could hide my face. "I can't help it," I whispered. He pushed me back onto the mattress and made quick work of removing the rest of my clothes. He divested his own impatiently and threw them aside. I had a feeling in the morning we'd have trouble finding everything, but Gabe didn't seem to care. I couldn't help but stare at him. The movement of his well-defined muscles as he moved over me was almost hypnotic. I tentatively wrapped my fingers around his forearm so that I could feel the sinew shift as he moved. He gave me a knowing smirk as my hand trailed higher, but he didn't comment. He kissed my neck gently, then my collarbone. He kept kissing my skin, moving lower with each contact. I shuddered as he reached my stomach. It started to dawn on me that he wasn't going to stop moving down, and I could feel my face getting impossibly warm. I felt like I was going to go crazy. Every touch set my nerve endings buzzing. It was too much for my brain to process. I didn't think I'd survive what he was planning now. He grabbed my thighs firmly and pushed my legs apart. He grinned at me, and I had to close my eyes. The arousal I was feeling was battling my embarrassment, and I wasn't sure what was going to win. There was no hesitation from Gabe, no ceremony. I nearly screamed when his tongue touched me. He repeated the motion, and I bit my lip to keep quiet. I didn't have the words to describe the sensation. Apparently, that was all the time he was going to give me to adjust because the slow, deliberate movements became continual. He lapped at me, and I arched against him, desperate for more. I couldn't stop the pitiful, pleading whines coming from me. He kept a strong grip on my thighs to keep me from inadvertently kicking him away. I was building toward climax too fast. I opened my mouth to warn him, but all that came out was a low moan. My back arched involuntarily, and my thighs squeezed against him. He easily held me in the position he wanted me as my body began to shake beneath him. When my shuddering passed, I covered my face with my hands. I was mortified. I could feel the mattress dipping as Gabe moved, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him. He lifted me like I weighed nothing, and I found myself straddling his waist. His hands stroked soothingly over my sides, and he waited until I opened my eyes and looked down at him. He gave me a questioning look. I wanted to cover my face again. "Are you ready for me?" he asked softly. His baritone voice went straight through me, and all I could do was nod. "Good girl," he said. I groaned. He guided me over him. I leaned my forehead against his shoulder as he pressed against my opening. It was clear to me that he was waiting for me to initiate anything further. I wrapped my arms around him and adjusted my position until I could get the leverage I needed. He was being incredibly patient considering how hard his pulse was thrumming against my fingertips. I tried to keep my breathing even as I sank onto him.
He held my hips and steadied me. I couldn't make my breathing. Even everything felt so intense. It was too much and not enough. I didn't know how much longer this could last. It felt like an eternity before I was fully seated. Gabe waited for me to lift my head from his shoulder. When I did, he snapped his hips up, grinding against me. My head fell back and I moaned. His grip on my hips was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. His movements were strong and smooth, sending me rushing toward another climax. I could only hold on for the ride. My perception consisted of nothing outside of Gabe's touch and his increasingly haggard breathing. My muscles tensed and I wrapped myself around him as tightly as I could. He growled as his movements became less precise. I hoped that he would finish before I fell apart. The way I was shaking, it was only a matter of time. The only sound Gabe made as he finished was a gasp, while I threw my head back and howled my undeniable pleasure and collapsed into him. Chapter 16, Human Stuff. What the hell is that? Gabe's voice pulled me to consciousness. I could feel his arm around my waist as I blinked the sleep from my eyes. I looked over my shoulder at him. What? I asked groggily when he didn't respond. I looked down at where his hand was resting on my side. In the morning light, Gabe could see the bruise on my ribs. The rage that had stolen over his face was truly frightening to behold. It's not that bad, I said quickly. He looked like he was ready to kill someone. When I get my hands on, I rolled onto Gabe's chest and kissed him. The movement surprised him enough to derail his anger. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me closer. I'm okay, said softly. It doesn't even hurt. He kissed me and ran his hand lightly over the bruise. I will not allow something like this to happen again, he said firmly. I wanted to argue, but decided against it. It was nice that he wanted to protect me. Thank you, I said softly. My response seemed to placate him. He kissed me again, then sat up, lifting me into his lap. Take a shower. I'll have clothes sent up for you. I have to get to a meeting. All ready, I asked. He just nodded and stood. I couldn't help but watch him as he crossed the room and dressed. I really do need to get my clothes and things. Can't you send for them? He asked. Have someone mail them to you. I guess I could ask my landlord. I said thoughtfully, if I sent her enough money, she might be willing to go to the trouble. I don't have that much. Let me know what you need, he said dismissively. He paused and an irritated expression crossed his face. Why is she back? He muttered to himself. Who? I asked. I sat up and stretched. There was no point in trying to go back to sleep. Assault, he said. I was harsh with her yesterday. I'm surprised she's back. I fumed thoughtfully. I certainly had some thoughts about that, but it didn't seem like a good idea to voice them. Gabe was so angry about what had happened. I was afraid that if I told him I thought Estelle was behind it, he might overreact. The way she talked about him made it seem like they were very close. Gabe's reaction to her presence right now made me question that. How long have you and Estelle known each other? I asked as casually as I could. It seems like she's here a lot. We grew up together. Gabe sat beside me and placed his hand on the bruise again. It was really bothering him. She comes by to see her father. He's here every day. Her father. I asked curiously. Isolde wasn't coming just to see Gabe. That was news to me. Was Gaberly not aware of Isolde's attraction to him? She wasn't exactly subtle. Then again, Gabe was a busy man. Maybe he really just didn't pay attention to her. I bet that drove her crazy. Charles, he answered simply. Charles is her father, I said in surprise. Well, that makes sense. If Charles was aware that his daughter wanted to be the Luna, he'd obviously want me gone. I was just an obstacle that stood in the way of Isolde getting what she wanted. What do you mean? Gabe asked with a frown. I shook my head. Just that I should have seen the family resemblance. I lied. This was a little trickier than I realized. Charles and Isolde would be angry to see me back. They'd probably keep trying to get rid of me. Maybe I could confide in Val, but wouldn't he be obligated to tell Gabe? I didn't have any proof that Isolde had started the rumor, and I didn't have proof that Charles had told me to leave. If I made an accusation without proof, it would just cause more issues for Gabe. That's the last thing I wanted. I'd made my choice to stay now. I had to figure out how to acclimate to life in the pack. If I couldn't do that, then I would only be a hindrance to Gabe. I still wasn't sure if I loved him, but I knew that I wanted to give this a chance. Are you all right? I looked up at him and blinked. I hope he hadn't been talking because I had completely spaced out. I'm fine, just tired. He nodded at that, then stood. I have to go. If you need anything, just come find me. I smiled at him, and he paused for a moment before heading out the door. I sighed and threw myself back on the bed. This was complicated. I felt coming back was the right decision, and my wolf certainly agreed. But I couldn't help but feel like my problems were just beginning. I showered and, as promised, found a new dress laid out on the bed. I took my time getting ready. By the time I got downstairs, Gabe was in another meeting. Val had to go to the school. He was trying to stem the tide of rumors among the students. He offered to let me tag along, but I declined. I was a little skittish about going back into the village just yet. I was walking toward the library when I heard voices. I paused, recognizing one as Isolde. I knew I shouldn't eavesdrop, but I couldn't help myself. I don't know, Isolde, I might have run too. An unfamiliar female voice said. You know why she came back, Isolde said snidely. I could feel myself sneering at her word. She's got nothing in the human world. No money, no family. Her tone was bitter. Whoever she was talking to, she didn't feel the need to fake sweetness like she usually did. She wants to be the Luna so she can feel special. That was enough. I walked around the corner and straight toward them. Isolde moved away from the woman she had been talking to and straightened her shirt nervously. She knew I'd overheard her. The other woman was short with warm amber skin and dark, tightly coiled hair. I recognized her as the woman that had tried to help me at the craft fair. Hello, Estelle, the strange woman said. I smiled at her and held my hand out. Hi, I said, we haven't met, have we? She looked surprised but shook my hand. No, actually, she said, I'm lucky. Oh, I said in genuine surprise, Val's mate, it's so nice to meet you. She looked surprised and glanced uncertainly at Isolde. I wondered what else Isolde might have told her about me. Val mentioned me. He always gets the biggest smile on his face when he talks about you, I said. He hadn't mentioned her to me by name. Val seems like a pretty private guy. But every time I talk to him about mates, he lit up. She smiled, and I could see her cheeks turn a little pink. That's sweet, she said softly. If you're looking for him, he just left. He said something about dealing with an issue at the school. I shot a look at Isolde, and she lifted her head and glared down at me. I know, Lucky said sadly. He's been so busy lately. I'm really sorry about that, I said sincerely. I'm sorry that my arrival has caused so many issues. I really wish I knew who was spreading these rumors so that I could try to talk things through with them. Lucky glanced at Isolde, but the taller woman just kept glaring at me. Just as I thought Isolde was bad at that. She couldn't keep the hateful look off of her face when I was in front of her. I think we're all sorry about how things are going. Lucky said, why don't we go get something to eat? I've been dying to meet you, she said suddenly. I was surprised, and I knew that it showed on my face, really. Yes, she said. She looked amused. I'm sure Gabe wouldn't mind. I know how protective he can be. She shot a look at Isolde. I'm sure you haven't had a chance to explore much. I've been nervous, I said, honestly, and after what happened, What? No one is going to bother you, she promised. She looked sincere, and my instincts were telling me I could trust her. Besides, I couldn't see Val being with anyone mean or two-faced. Okay, I said. Thank you. Isol looked outraged. I'll see you later, she said through gritted teeth. She stormed off and left us alone in the hallway. She's been giving you a hard time, hasn't she? Lucky asked. I gave a non-committal shrug. She's the one starting all of these rumors, isn't she? She started to walk down the hall, and I followed after her. Maybe I said I didn't know for certain, but I was sure it was her. I couldn't tell Lucky that, though. You haven't told Gabe that? I don't know anything for certain, so I haven't told him anything. I said, he does have a temper, she said thoughtfully. We walked in silence for a little while. It was a clear morning, and the smell of flowers was strong in the air. Summer would be ending soon. It was nice to enjoy the sunshine while it lasted. About half the pack hates you, Lucky said suddenly. I frowned. That sucks. I didn't know what else to say. Half the pack probably hadn't even seen me yet. Lucky laughed. Don't take it too personally. Most of them hated me too. You aren't from this pack, I asked. No, she said with a smile. I lived on my own in the human world for years before I met Val. That shocked me, the way that Charles and Isolde threw around the word human. You'd think it was a curse. This pack has been through a lot, she said softly. When they get to know you, they'll come around. I feel like the damage is done at this point, I said softly. She shook her head. Now I said half the pack, the other half is thrilled. You're here. Gabe deserves to find some happiness. She stopped outside the cafe and opened the door for me. I hesitated. This place was pretty busy every time I walked by it. That's why I'd never stepped inside. Lucky gave me an encouraging nod, and I went in. The place smelled like cinnamon and coffee. It was warm and brightly lit with baby pink stripes painted on the walls. I walked to the counter with Lucky at my side. I want Gabe to be happy, I said. I thought that might be easier for him if I left. But, you couldn't do it, she finished for me. He's your mate. I can't imagine how much it would hurt to walk away from that, even if you thought it was for the best. The girl behind the counter gave me a funny look as she stepped up to take our orders. I picked the first iced option on the menu. Food was really the last thing on my mind right now. Lucky ordered tea and a couple of muffins. So half the pack hates me, I said thoughtfully. Why? Exactly. A little bird has convinced them that you're after Gabe for power and influence. That's asinine, I scoffed. If I wanted that, wouldn't I be parading around the village to show off instead of hiding at the inn? You'd think so, Lucky said meaningfully. Although she wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the barista. And suddenly, I had a feeling that she'd brought me here for a reason. Chapter 17, Redcoat, Gabe. The relief of having Estelle back was short-lived. I was no closer to finding the person responsible for the rumors about her, and seeing the livid bruise on her side was at the forefront of my mind. It must have been painful. I didn't understand why she insisted that it wasn't. I didn't really understand Estelle at all for someone who'd fought so hard to leave. She changed her mind so easily. Then again, if the pull she felt was anywhere near as strong as mine, I was impressed she'd resisted it at all. From the moment I caught her scent, I knew that I had to have her. The desire I felt to possess her was a weakness, and if I could overcome it, I would. It would be too easy for an enemy to use her against me. I knew that I was being irrational and that my rage would cause concerns in the pack, but I still couldn't contain it. There was no going back. Now, not after last night, I understood now how irrational Val could be about Lucky. I wanted to find the boy that harmed my mate and tear him apart.
My duties to the pack had always come first. Since I was a child, I'd been made to understand that my priority should be to restore the pack and protect it at all costs. I'd hurt a lot of people to make that happen. I'd killed and I'd terrorized to ensure the safety of the pack. I'd gained the nickname, the Avenging Angel, though no one dared use it in my presence. I'd do far worse things for Estelle. The fact that I was forced to walk away from her this morning was infuriating. My wolf was rumbling in displeasure so loudly that I was finding it difficult to focus on what Charles was telling me. The visions that the Radcliffe pups are having cannot be ignored any longer. He insisted. I'm not ignoring them. I responded I could smell rum. Estelle had come downstairs. You must meet with them. Nothing that you or Isolde have reported about their visions merits a visit from me? I said with boredom in my voice. I should still be in bed with my mate. The fact that this was the important business Charles had insisted on seeing me about was maddening. They're seeing visions of the past, distressing, but nothing that I need to be involved in. Their connection to the moon goddess is undeniable, Charles said emphatically. So bring them to Edwina. She's the priestess. Gabe, this is of the utmost importance. I rolled my eyes at him. Why, I demanded, explain to me why it is so vital that I deal with this personally. I have other pressing matters that need my attention. That girl hardly qualifies. Watch your mouth, I said slowly. Charles stared at me for a long, tense moment, then sighed. I'm concerned that visions of the past would come to the pack now, he said seriously. I don't think it's a coincidence that they started around the time Estelle arrived in the city. I narrowed my eyes at him. He was insinuating that Estelle was somehow related to our betrayal. There was a possibility that she was born from that pack. The timing would be about right, and it would explain how a pup ended up in the human world. I had already considered that possibility. I simply didn't care. If Estelle had come from that pack, she'd hardly be the only one in the village that did. Before, they'd been our closest allies, and marriages between our packs were common and celebrated occurrences. That was what had made the attack so shocking. If I didn't address this and word somehow got out about this theory, it would only cause more rumors to spread about Estelle. If my mate were harmed again, I would not allow the incident to pass without retribution. It was better to try to avoid it. Fine, I said, tell the twins to be here Friday after school. Thank you, Charles said in relief. I asked tersely, am I free of you for the day? I may have been too harsh toward him, but he and Isolde had been underfoot so much lately that I was truly tired of their presence. He looked offended, but nodded. Good, go find a better way to spend your day. I stood and walked out of the room. The smell of rum had grown faint, and it bothered me that I didn't know where Estelle had gone. Isolde was waiting just around the corner. I couldn't miss the citron candy apple of her scent. Gabe, she greeted me immediately and rushed toward me. I was hoping I'd find you. Do you have time? No, I said firmly. I don't care what it's about. A strange look passed over her face before her expression settled into a pout. Where is Estelle? I demanded, getting coffee with Lucky. I turned to find Val walking toward me. Isolde looked like she wanted to speak, but a warning glance from me silenced her. She quietly walked past me and headed down the hallway towards Charles. Good, I said. Lucky was probably the best person she could be with right now. No one would dare insult Estelle within earshot of her. If they did, Lucky would handle the situation before it could even be brought to my attention. I'm pleased to, Val said. Mama Ida saw them walking together and asked me if I'd finally introduced them. They must have just run into each other. He looked pleased. I knew that he worried about Lucky being lonely when he was away. It would be good for both of them if they could become friends. However, they met. I'm glad, I said.
So am I, because I need to talk to you and I wouldn't dare try to pry you away from her. Val grinned knowingly at me and I shrugged. It wasn't my fault if someone had heard. Estelle was the one screaming, not that I didn't take extreme satisfaction in that fact.
How did things go at the school? I asked.
All right, he said the kids had a million questions about Estelle. Also, a new rumor is going around. They say you scared Aiden Barlow so bad he pissed his pants. He was giving me that disappointed, fatherly look that he always gave me when he thought I'd taken something too far. Maybe he'll learn a lesson about rumors, I said coldly. He was lucky I didn't do far worse. The image of that bruise was still fresh in my mind. He'll learn that his alpha isn't to be trifled with, if nothing else. Val said, "That's not what you wanted to talk to me about," I said. I could tell that there was something else on his mind. He wouldn't have bothered me over something like that.
These rumors aren't going to stop until the pack gets to know Estelle, Val said firmly.
He didn't raise his voice often, but I knew from his tone that it was coming. The sudden shift in his tone startled me. It seemed like this was something he'd been wanting to say for a while. What would you suggest? I asked if Val had some insight that could help resolve the tension in the pack. I was more than happy to hear it. Goddess Neutrals had been nothing but unhelpful. His only suggestion had been to reject Estelle. A feast, Val said simply. She needs to be formally introduced as your mate. I frowned. I loathe that kind of social. I know, but it isn't for you. He stared at me steadily. He was right. It could only help Estelle, and my momentary discomfort was worth that. I probably should have arranged something like this from the beginning, but I'd been so busy trying to address the rogue issue.
Fine. I could feel my frown deepen at the relieved smile that Val shot at me. Don't look so pleased with yourself, I grumbled.
I can't help it, he said teasingly. You're in love. I glared at him. Don't toy with me. Be grumpy about it all you want, he said dismissively. If anyone but Val talked to me like this, I'd send them through a wall. Coming from him, I just glared. She's a nice girl. Maybe she'll finally help you mellow out. I don't have the luxury of being easygoing, I said bitterly. The balance that Val brought to the pack was necessary, but he had to know that it was only possible because of me. No, never easygoing. He laughed. That wouldn't suit you at all. Was there anything else, or are you just going to mock me? I demanded. I could hardly smell Estelle anymore, and the distance was making me uneasy. I needed to keep her close to ensure that she wasn't hurt again. There is actually one more thing, he said seriously. He glanced around and stepped closer to me. I finished interviewing everyone that was at the craft fair. Natalie Baker is the only one that claimed to see Estelle make her escape. She shifted. He said, I thought as much. I didn't understand why that would be a serious matter. It would make the most sense for her to shift in her fear. It was far more reasonable than to think that she ran over 10 miles into town. Right, Val said, what's strange is her wolf form. Natalie swears that it was red. Red? I repeated. I wasn't certain I'd heard him correctly. I'd never seen a shifter with a red coat. I'd never even heard of it. Red as a flame, Val said emphatically. What does that mean? I asked. I could feel myself frowning, but I couldn't temper my reaction. Estelle was strange for a lot of reasons. Could an unusual coat be related to her abandonment? I wasn't sure. I have no idea, Val said, but I think we should look into it. It might help us find out more about where she comes from. I nodded. I agree. We should look into it. But I don't want it getting out that we're digging into her past. It could be misconstrued. The last thing we need is more rumors about my mate. I'll look into it myself, Val offered. Then we don't have to worry about any whispers getting out. You're loyal to a fault? I said softly. Val did much more than should be expected of him. I couldn't help but feel guilty, as though I were taking advantage of his kindness. You're my alpha, he said simply. What kind of beta would I be if I didn't help protect your mate? It was a reasonable response, but it wasn't the whole story, and we both knew it. Val had been like an older brother to me. He was the one that was there for me when I struggled with the responsibilities of being alpha, and he was the one that encouraged me to follow my gut, even when my advisors had something else in mind. If not for Val's encouragement over the years, I likely would have taken Charles's advice and rejected Estelle, and who knows what would have happened then. Di nodded again and stalked out of the room with the questions about her past swirling in my mind. Chapter 18, Moon Goddess. Estelle. I should have spoken up about Isolde a week ago. If I had, Gabe wouldn't have sent me off with her to learn about the responsibilities of being a Luna. I'd wanted to protest, but Gabe was so preoccupied with the upcoming feast that I hadn't wanted to upset him. Things had been strange between us. I'd moved into his room, but it still felt like we barely saw each other. We were still arguing. Gabe was driving me crazy with his insistence on always knowing where I was and who I was with. I'd made an attempt to go out more, as Lucky insisted it would help me feel better and calm the pack's fears about me. It seemed to be working. People waved to me on the streets, and I hadn't caught anyone whispering about me recently. As happy as my wolf was to have Gabe nearby, I was finding it difficult. I couldn't completely blame him for his concern. A few nights ago, one of the men on patrol was attacked. Thankfully, he only suffered minor injury. It seemed the rogue was still prowling around out there, and he was getting bold. Gabe was furious about it. None of that made me feel better about being stuck with Isolde for the day. The tension in the air was so thick, I thought I might choke on it. If I did, at least I'd be free of the withering glare Isolde had fixed me with. It had stolen over her features the moment we were alone. Let's get this over with. I said, neither of us want to do this. You shouldn't be here. Isolde said bitterly. You should have left when you had the chance. You have no idea the trouble you're causing, Gabe. She had one hand planted firmly on her hip as she glared down at me. The trouble I'm causing him? Are you joking? I actually laughed. It was so absurd. No one wants you here, she hissed. No, you don't want me here. Believe it or not, princess, your experience of the world isn't universal. You don't get to speak for everyone. I shot back. She was such a spoiled brat. Gabe is going to see you for what you are, she sneered, and he'll kick you to the curb. I'm glad he asked me to do this. You need to know exactly how unprepared you are for the life of a Luna. I just rolled my eyes. She was right. I was unprepared. That's why Gabe wanted someone to show me around. I just wish it wasn't her. I was sure she tripped over herself to do Gabe a favor before even hearing what it was. We'll start with the healer, she said. Keep up. My wolf was growling as I trailed behind her. I tried to calm it by thinking about Gabe. Even when we would end the night arguing, I had woken up every day with his arm around me. Maybe it was just because he was possessive, but it made me feel secure. I hoped that going through with this would ease Gabe's mind and make things easier between us. The building that Isolde led me to was a squat brick building with vines covering the face of it. I could smell herbs as we approached the door. I couldn't help but frown. I hated hospitals, and although this wasn't exactly the same, it was close enough. We stepped inside and found an older man sitting in a recliner. He was reading a book and didn't seem to notice our entry. It took me a moment to recognize him. He was the elder that had been talking with Gabe Charles and it about me. The one that had a problem with me being raised by humans. Good morning, Giles, Isolde said sweetly. The man lifted his weary blue eyes and smiled. Hello, dear. He stood to greet her, but paused when he saw me. I could see his expression harden. What can I do for you?
Gabe asked me to bring Estelle around and tell her a little about what it takes to be the Luna, she explained. I could tell that Giles was barely containing a grimace as he looked me over. Well, he said it's not a position that just anyone can fill. The Luna is the heart of the pack.
Isolde nodded gravely at that and clasped her hands in front of her. I had to resist the urge to roll my eyes. I'd be grateful if you could give me some specifics to work with, I said.
For example, he said as he walked to a large window and opened the shades, when a pup is born, the Luna will organize the support for the mother.
The household must be maintained while the mother and pup bond. This means taking care of the mother as well as the rest of the family. Do you have any experience with pup?
I knew by his wording that my answer wouldn't satisfy him a little. I volunteered to help with the little ones in the group home sometimes. I said I didn't want to elaborate, and he didn't ask me to.
The same goes for injuries. If someone is hurt and unable to care for their family, the Luna arranges care for their pups and ensures they have food and anything else they may need.
I nodded. Are all of the Luna's duties domestic in nature?
I asked.
For the most part, he said family is very important in a pack.
Well, I said slowly, I don't have much experience with family.
I've heard he said that. That doesn't mean that I don't recognize the importance. I think you could argue I'm uniquely aware of the consequences of lacking a good support system. I think it's great that the pack takes community support so seriously.
Giles looked surprised by this. He gave me an appraising look and smiled a little.
Our pack has struggled. Not all of our families are what could be called traditional. There are a lot of ways to define family. I said a little scoffed before she could stop herself and tried to disguise it as a cough.
You all right? I asked. When I looked at her, she was glaring.
Fine. We'll go to the school next. Isolde said, getting to know the pack's little ones is incredibly important for the Luna. Are you any good with pups? She looked down at me and forced a smile.
I guess we'll find out. I said my answer annoyed her, which made me smile. She huffed and walked out without another word.
Thanks for the info, Giles, I said. I waved and hurried after Isolde. Getting under her skin was fun, but I did have to stick out this stupid tour to the end. It would mean another fight with Gabe if I didn't.
The school looked a lot like some of the old brick schools I'd gone to. The main difference was that there were no separate buildings for the different age groups. The village was too small for that to be necessary.
Sometimes the pups struggle, Isolde said.
No shit, I muttered to myself.
If it seems like a serious issue, the teachers or parents may come to the Luna for help. She continued as if she hadn't heard me.
We entered the school, and it startled me that the doors were unlocked, and we didn't need to buzz in. We had arrived between classes, apparently, so the halls were full of children of all ages. Some stopped and stared at us, but most rushed by without paying us any attention.
So the Luna is in charge of community and family support, I said simply. Isolde just shook her head.
She opened her mouth, but instead of responding, she just stared behind me. I turned to look and found a pair of twin girls, maybe 7 years old, standing behind me. One wore a blue dress and the other was in green. If not for that, I wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. They had the same brown hair, copper skin, and dark eyes.
Hello, Red, the girl in blue said.
Estelle, Isolde said tensely. One look at her face told me these kids made her intensely uncomfortable. Meet Iris, she indicated the girl in blue, and Coral, the Radcliffe twin.
I'd heard that name before, but I couldn't remember where. I looked back at the girls and smiled. I kneeled in front of them.
My name is Estelle. It's nice to meet you. I said. They were giving me friendly, almost excited smile.
We're sorry for your loss, Iris said softly. We're glad that you've been found, Coral said with a grin.
That's sweet of you, I said uncertainly. I wasn't really sure what they meant by loss, but I could imagine the rumors about my being adopted had definitely made the rounds by now.
The moon goddess knew you were ready to find us, Iris said softly. She glanced at Isal. So we can help you find yourself, Coral said in a sing-song voice. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time following. I tilted my head a little. They were being cryptic, but in the way kids sometimes are when they forget that others can't hear their thoughts. They weren't doing it on purpose. Iris cupped her mouth with her hand and leaned in close. I turned my head so she could whisper into my ear. Have the dreams started? I jolted back. How did you know? They're memories from someone close to you, Coral said softly. She touched my arm comfortingly. Is this about your visions? Isol demanded. The girls both frowned and stared up at her. Be careful, Red, Coral said. She kept her eyes fixed on Isolde. The past comes back to haunt sometime. You'll be safe if you trust the right people, Iris assured me. Before I could ask any questions, Iris took Coral's hand and they hurried down the hallway. I stood slowly and watched them vanish around a corner. What the hell was that? I asked softly. The twins are connected to the moon goddess, Isolde said matter-of-factly. Moon goddess. Isolde stared at me in open shock. She stared for long enough that it made me feel self-conscious, and I wrapped my arms around myself. You don't even know about the moon goddess, she asked softly. I'm sorry, You can never be our Luna, Isolde said in disgust. You know, nothing about our way of life. Nothing about our goddess. How could anyone expect you to understand the importance of a pack? You don't even know what it means to be part of a family. Yeah. Stood unable to respond. I felt like a dagger had just pierced my heart. Isolde looked satisfied with herself as if she'd finally hit the target she'd been aiming at all along. I could feel the tears in my eyes. As much as I didn't want to give her the satisfaction, there was nothing I could do to stop them. Are you finally getting it? She asked. You don't belong here. Yeah. Her head snapped back with the impact of my fist, and a spurt of blood shot out before she could clamp her hand over her nose. I felt the crunch and knew I'd done some real damage. She just stared at me in disbelief. I growled my frustration and stormed away. I'd wanted to do that for weeks. It felt even better than I'd imagined, but I knew it was going to cause some serious hell when Gabe found out. Chapter 19, Celebration. Estelle. I was right. He had called for me after what I could only assume was a very tense meeting with Charles, only he didn't look angry. He didn't look much of anything. Truthfully, explain to me why you hit Isolde yesterday, Gabe said, rubbing his temples like I was a child he was scolding for the 100th time. She said I couldn't be the Luna because I don't know what it means to be part of a family. I said bitterly. I was sitting in the parlor with Gabe. I couldn't look him in the eye. You broke her nose. I know, I said I did not feel bad about hitting her, but I still shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have let her get under my skin, and I certainly shouldn't have done it the day before the feast. Gabe and Val had put a lot of work into planning this party to introduce me to the pack, and I ruined it by punching Isolde. Charles is furious, he said. His expression was stony as he stared at me. I stood up and threw my hands in the air. Then he should have taught her to shut her damn mouth. I agree, Gabe said simply. I sat back in my chair and stared at him. Was it my imagination or did he look amused? You do? She needs to learn to respect you, he said. The feast will go forward as planned. Isolde has chosen not to attend. That's it. I asked. I was expecting another fight, but Gabe seemed completely unbothered by this. Yes, he said. He stood and walked toward the door. The feast starts soon. I sat in silence for a few minutes after he'd left. Maybe Gabe just thought my actions were justified. Obviously, he got angry when he felt disrespected. Hitting Isolde might seem like a natural reaction to him. Even so, shouldn't he be upset that I hit his childhood friend and the daughter of his mentor? Why was I questioning it? I had lucked out, and it seemed like Gabe and I might get through the night without an argument. I wasn't sure what to expect with this feast. Gabe hadn't said much other than that it was a social obligation. I spent a little while up in our room getting ready. All I knew was that I'd have to make a statement in front of the entire pack. I had no idea what I was going to say. I tried to make sure that I looked presentable, but I still didn't have much in the way of grooming supplies. The green dress that Mama Ida had brought me on my first night in the village was the nicest I had, so I wore that. I made my way out to the town center where the party would be held. The smell of roast meat and fresh pastries filled the air. It was a cool night, but not cold. The crowd was huge. It looked like the entire pack was there. The atmosphere was like a carnival. Laughter and music filled the air. The closer I got, the more I could see the happy faces on the kids as they ran circles around their parents and played. This was nothing like the pomp and circumstance I'd imagined. I was so much more comfortable with it. I could smell Gabe nearby, but I couldn't see him over the crowd. I took my time heading toward him. It was nice to see everyone gathered together and having fun. Red, a little voice called to me. I looked to see Coral and Iris running toward me.
"Hello," I said as I knelt to greet them.
"Can you tell us apart?" one of them asked. I narrowed my eyes. It felt like it would be a mistake to assume the colors of their shirts were an indication this time. I took a moment to think about the last time I'd seen them. "Coral," I said, pointing to one of them.
Her little face lit up brightly and she jumped and clapped her hands. "I knew that you would recognize us."
"How did you know?" Iris asked suspiciously. "Carl has a beauty mark right here," I said, indicating a small birthmark just in front of her left ear. Iris nodded, as if that was the correct answer, then smiled slightly. "We're glad that you're here." "Thank you," I said softly. "I'm glad you're here too. Now go have fun. There's so much to do." They smiled at me before Coral took Iris by the hand and dragged her off. I stood and headed toward Gabe again. So far, this was going well. No one was looking at me strangely. Mama Ida waved at me and held her glass up in a salute. I waved back to her. She was sitting with Giles, who tilted his head to me in greeting. It might be wishful thinking, but he seemed to be warming up to me. I was walking toward them when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see Lucky waving me down. "This is great," I said when I reached her. "It is, isn't it?" She smiled and looked around at the happy crowd. "It's been too long since we've all gotten together like this." "Really?" I asked. Everyone looked so happy. I could hear children laughing a few feet away, and it was hard not to smile. The festive atmosphere, good food, and laughter painted the village in an idyllic light. It reminded me of the night I first arrived. It felt like something out of a movie. Despite the conflict so far, I was happy that I had the opportunity to stay. "Gabe is looking for you. It's just about time for your introduction." I looked back at Lucky and forced a smile. "The stage is that way." She pointed through the crowd. When I stood on my toes, I could see Gabe. "Wish me luck," I said nervously. I groaned when I got close enough to see who Gabe was talking to. Of course, it was Charles. I thought about turning around and sneaking away, but Gabe saw me and motioned me over. Charles looked oddly calm as I approached. There was a drink in his hand, and he raised it in a salute to Gabe before stepping away. I couldn't help but fidget nervously. "It's nothing, you're just saying hello?" He wasn't looking at me as he spoke. He was scanning the crowd. It seemed odd to me that he was so tense considering how happy everyone seemed. "Are you all right?" I asked. He looked at me and frowned slightly. "I'm fine. Are you ready?"
Sure, I sighed. Gabe stepped onto the wooden platform that had been constructed in the town square.
The crowd quieted gradually without him lifting a finger or saying a word. The respect they had for him was impressive.
Although, judging by the expression of some in the crowd, it might have been fear more than respect.
You know that I don't often speak in public. Gabe said, his voice easily reached the far end of the square.
I could feel all of the eyes on us, and it made my throat feel dry. I looked at my feet and tried to pretend that I was anywhere else. But it's past time that I introduce my mate to the pack. He gestured toward me, and I stepped forward.
I'm Estelle, I said. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. I cleared my throat and tried to make my voice loud and clear.
I know you've already heard a lot about me. I can tell you that some of it is true. I could see some people exchanging concerned looks.
I never knew my family because of that. I know that some of you worry I'm not fit to be Gabe's mate.
I can understand why. I don't know what it means to be a part of a family. Isolde was right. She was just a bitch about it.
I hope that you'll give me a chance to learn what family is about by letting me join yours. A single cheer went up, and I snapped my head toward the sound in surprise. I smiled, seeing that it was Coral.
Iris clapped along with her sisters, cheering. I waved to them, and they waved back frantically. A laugh went through the crowd along with scattered applause.
Gabe said a few more words, but I was too overwhelmed to really listen. I followed him from the stage. We spent the next few hours moving through the crowd and speaking with dozens of people. I would never remember all of the names, but I tried. People were having a good time. I credited the food and drink with the kind smiles and handshakes that I received, even from people that seemed standoffish at first. It seemed like this feast was just what the pack needed to assuage their fears about me. It was getting late, and people were starting to make their way from the square toward home. Most of the kids had gone by now, and many of the adults that were left seemed a little drunk. Charles was no exception to that. He had another drink in his hand as he approached me. I looked around nervously for Gabe, but he was nowhere to be seen. I braced myself for whatever might come of this. That was quite a speech, Charles said with a grin. Thanks, I said softly. I hadn't been alone with him since he'd showed up at the motel and told me to leave. Considering I'd just broken his daughter's nose, I didn't trust that this would be a pleasant interaction. It seems like it went over. Well, it did, he said brightly. Then he frowned and shook his head gravely. You know, I just can't wrap my head around how you ended up orphaned in the human world. His voice was so loud that everyone around us could hear him. How could it be that anyone would abandon their pup? A hush passed over the crowd like a wave as people stopped and stared at him. I wasn't sure what I could say to that. Judging by the look in his eye, he wasn't as drunk as he was pretending to be. I don't want to talk.
Maybe your mother was a rogue.
He shouted excitedly as if the thought had just occurred to him. Or maybe there was just something wrong with you. He added thoughtfully, maybe you were born wrong, and she was ashamed. I could hear Gabe's growl from across the square. The crowd parted as he stalked toward us. He looked like he was out for blood. I couldn't let this devolve into another catastrophe. This was my chance to change the way the pack saw me. If it ended with Gabe and Charles fighting, it would prove that I was nothing but backluck. I watched Gabe approach. His eyes were flashing silver and his teeth were bared in a snarl. I laughed softly at first, then louder. This was absurd. Gabe stopped in his tracks and stared at me, the same way Charles was staring at me, as if I'd lost my mind. You're sloshed, I cried, pointing at Charles. You really can't hold your beer, can you? He looked confused and opened his mouth without speaking for a few seconds.
Then, as if the reality of the situation were just dawning on him, he looked around us. "My apologies," he said softly. "Eat something," I told him firmly, tried to sober up a little. "We don't want you embarrassing yourself." Slowly, the crowd around us came back to life. A few people laughed nervously, then the chatter started back up. I patted Charles on the shoulder, hard enough to let him know that my anger was very real. Then I walked away as quickly and steadily as I could. Chapter 20. Don't hide from me, Estelle. I managed to hold my tears back until I reached the house. Just when I thought things were getting better, Charles had to go and say something awful like that. It must have been his way of getting revenge for Isolde's broken nose. Part of me wished that I'd punched him too. When I reached the bedroom, I lay on the bed and pulled the pillow tightly to my chest. It smelled like Gabe, and it helped to calm me a little. I couldn't help but wonder what truth there was to Charles's words. Maybe my mother was a rogue, and that's why there'd been no pack to support her when I was born. Or maybe there was something wrong with me. I'd spent most of my life worrying that I was insane, that there was some genetic mental illness lurking inside of me. Maybe it was true. That bastard. Gabe's voice rumbled in the darkness. I was crying so hard I hadn't even heard him come in. Before I could sit up or try to hide my tears, he sat beside me. "He'll answer for these tears," he said angrily. All I could do was shake my head as he lay beside me and pulled me into his arms. I didn't want him to fight with Charles. It was my fault for escalating things with Isolde. "I'm just being dramatic," I said weakly. I could feel his chest vibrate as he growled. "Why do you do that?" he demanded. "Why do you minimize and conceal your pain from me?" I bit my lip and tried to calm myself down. "Don't take it personally," I said softly. That answer clearly didn't satisfy him. He tilted my head up and made me look him in the eye. I let out a shaky breath. "I'm not used to anyone caring," I admitted. Something in his eyes softened, but the change was so subtle. "I may have imagined I care," he said firmly. "So don't insult me by disregarding my concern." I wanted to push back at that part of me couldn't accept that he cared, but there was no sign of deception from him. I knew that Gabe wasn't a liar. I could feel my lip quiver as I looked into his eye. I wanted to hide my face, but he was still holding my jaw. "I don't want you to see me cry like this," I managed to say. He let go of my face, but pulled me closer to his chest. After a moment of resistance, I melted into his arms and wept. My entire body was shaking. The dam had broken and I couldn't stem the flow of emotion. Now, Gabe held me close and waited. He didn't stroke my hair or tell me everything would be okay. He just held me. His warmth and the strength of his arms around me kept me grounded. I don't know how long I cried when it was over. I tangled my hands in Gabe's shirt and squeezed him tight. "Thank you," I said softly. He made a sound of affirmation, but he didn't speak. I pulled away from his arms and sat up. I felt better, but I was also embarrassed. "Charles will answer for that," Gabe said as he sat beside me. "He was just getting a dig in because he's mad. I punched Isolde," I said. He smirked a little. "You stood up for yourself," he said, "as you should." He huffed a laugh and tucked my hair behind my ear. The look on his face was one of amusement. "Do you think it's funny?" I said as realization dawned. "You think it's funny that I hit her?" "Isolde has gotten her way for far too long. She needed a reminder that her actions have consequences," he said. "Isn't she your friend?" I asked. I was so confused by the dynamic at play here. "That's not the word I would use for it," he said cryptically. If Isolde's feelings for Gabe were really one-sided, then I guess it made sense that she would resent me so much. In a way, I didn't blame her. Gabe was strong, intelligent, loyal, and attractive. Wanting him was only natural. Surely Estelle had her own mate, though. Why was she so determined to take mine?
You're staring, Gabe said. I felt heat rush to my face. I had been staring at him for the past few minutes without realizing it. Sorry, I said shyly.
Don't apologize. He smirked at me and pulled me onto his lap. I wrapped my arms around his neck and kissed him. It felt good to have his arms around me. I felt wanted. It was a strange feeling for me and one that I wanted to savor. His hands slid up my thighs beneath my dress and settled on my hips. The contact sent a thrill through me. I gasped, breaking our kiss. He nuzzled my neck and stroked my hips with his thumb. He nipped my neck and made me groan. I ran my fingers through his hair and tilted my head back to encourage him. The sharp pinch of his teeth made me moan.
Mine, he growled softly. Who else's would I be? I said sarcastically. I couldn't explain why, but his possessive streak could be very endearing.
He looked annoyed and opened his mouth to respond, but I leaned in and nipped at his throat. In an instant, I was pinned to the mattress with my hands above my head. I arched against him, pulling a satisfying groan from him. You're eager, he said. He was clearly amused. He easily held my wrists in one hand. His strength was intimidating, and having him hold me so easily made me shudder. He slid his free hand up my thigh. Slowly, I arched my back and whined. It was embarrassing how easily he could reduce me to begging, but I wanted his touch too badly to care. That's my good girl, he rumbled. The praise made my face flush and my heartbeat stutter. Are you going to scream for me again? He teased. I would have hidden my face if I could. I was so embarrassed, it felt like my face would never stop burning. He must have decided to take pity on me because he kissed me gently and released my hands. I covered my face with my hands and turned my head away. I want you to look at me, he said. I took a moment to compose myself, but did as he asked. I'm your mate, he said softly. It's my job to protect you. I can't do that if you run away each time you're afraid. His face had become very serious as he spoke. I nodded to show him that I was listening. From now on, you run to me. Understand? I wanted to protest. Wouldn't it make me look weak to run to Gabe each time I was upset? Wouldn't it annoy him? I didn't want to be perceived as weak, and I didn't want to seem dependent on him. I quacked. Estelle, you come to me when you're upset. His tone left no room for argument. I searched his face. I will, I said softly. Gabe hadn't given me a reason to doubt him. Besides, when he fixed those intense blue eyes on me, there was nothing I could deny him. He smiled and kissed me lightly. Good girl, he said. Calling me that makes me want to be anything but good, I said quietly. I bit my lip, but it did nothing to hide the smirk that was forming on my face.
Gabe grinned down at me. Is that right? I nodded enthusiastically, and he chuckled at me. Why don't you show me how bad you can be? He said in a challenging tone. He pulled me close and kissed me. His hands found the zipper of my dress, and he wasted no time divesting me of it. I managed to get his shirt over his head before he pinned me again. This time, I didn't try to pry my hands free. I wrapped my legs around his waist and pulled him flush against me. He made a startled, breathy sound. I took advantage of his surprise to roll us over. I smiled as I straddled his hips. He grinned up at me, full of surprises. He rumbled. He played along as I took his wrists and raised them above his head. He took advantage of the position and bit lightly into my shoulder. I ground my hips down against his in response. I guess that was too much teasing because he flipped us and made quick work of the rest of our clothes. I held onto his forearms as he held himself over me. I couldn't keep my hands off of him. He wasted no time pushing into me, although he did so slowly.
I wasn't sure what to do. At first, I was so focused on the feeling of him that it didn't occur to me that I wasn't moving. I was hardly aware of anything outside of his skin on mine. His breath on my shoulder was steady, but becoming rapid.
I wrapped my arms around him and pulled him tight against me. I just wanted to feel him.
I was gasping and moaning with every movement, unable to hold anything back. Gabe's hands tensed in the sheet beside my head.
I dug my heels into the mattress and arched against him. The movement made him pause and shudder.
It sent electricity through me. I did it again, and this time Gabe moaned. He looked at me strangely, then started moving again. His rhythm was faster and his breathing far less steady. I couldn't help but smile. Apparently, I'd moved us into an angle that was better for both of us. Gabe sat back and grabbed my hips, pulling me with him and adjusting our position.
I was crying out continually, unable to hold back the sounds he was pulling from me.
For all I knew, half the pack was still milling around just below our window. I couldn't find it in myself to care at the moment. I gripped at his shoulders almost desperately, and the bite of my fingernails pulled another moan from him. The pleasure that was flowing through me was so intense that I feared I may actually pass out. I felt like I was floating. I was distantly aware that I was speaking, but I wasn't really sure what I was saying. I held on to Gabe as if he were the only thing keeping me tethered to my body. I arched against Gabe and gasped. I shook like I was going to explode, and Gabe held onto me until I collapsed back to the bed.
I panted and covered my face with my hands. I didn't want him to look at the mess he'd made of me. Gabe pulled my hands away gently and looked at me closely.
"Don't hide from me," he commanded. All I could do was nod. It was enough of an answer, and Gabe lay beside me and pulled me back into his arms. This part has ended. Thank you for listening. If you would like to continue listening to the next part, please let me know by leaving a comment.